The following weeks were like a parade to Palmer, with himself as the Grand Marshal. He felt as if he were marching down the middle of the boulevard, with crowds of people cheering from the sidewalks. Calls of "Hey Palmer" and "Hey Snots" flew across the summer days. From blocks around, kids came to see his arm. Little kids who would gather around 4 or 5 at a time. He would lift up the sleeve and they would show them, they would gasp and go, "Oh, wow." Some of them would reach out to touch. The squeamish ones would pull back their hands as if it was a hot stove, and they would shudder and squeak. Big kids didn't touch. They simply looked and nodded in grim respect, remembering their own treatment, and Palmer's heart would swell. Within 3 days, he could lift his left hand to his nose, and at the end of the week, he could reach above his head. He was almost sorry he was healing. He is enjoying showing off to the little kids. "Look, I can't lift my arm any higher than this." He enjoyed the amazement in their eyes. He wished the bruise would not go away. He wished she would not make him feel he would not could make them feel the tingle in their fingertips. One day he darkened the diminishing bruise with a purple crayon. One person was missing during this imaginary parade town on the boulevard, Dorothy Grusick. And for some reason, this bothered Palmer. Several times he saw her playing hopscotch in the front of her house, like Palmer's. She was good at playing by herself. Of course, Palmer had buddies now, so he would never have to play alone again. Not if he didn't want to. He wondered if girls grouped like boys. The first couple of times that Palmer walked past Dorothy didn't even look up from her hopscotch. This was very unusual. Dorothy had always said hi. So next time Palmer said to her, "Hi," Dorothy just went on hopping, one-footed, dark brown ponytail bobbing. "She's mad because I didn't invite her to my birthday party," thought Palmer. And that was understandable, but also besides the point. The point was getting her to look at that bruise. And the more she would not, the more Palmer wanted her to. Finally, he rolled up his left sleeve to the shoulder and plopped himself down on the front steps. She went on playing, tossing a green beanbag into the chalk-numbered squares, ignoring him. At last he thought of a funny thing to say. "Who's winning?" She said nothing. She tossed the beanbag to the farthest square and hopped down and back. She tossed the bag out again, and just when it seemed it would never speak, she said, "Thanks for inviting me to your party." It made no sense, but Palmer was thrilled to hear her voice. "It was all boys," he said. "Good," she said with a disdainful sniff. Sometimes it amazed him that this girl, just out of third grade, could make him feel so little. She went on hopping. "Did you hear my new name?" he said. She did not answer. He did not look up. "It's Snots!" A sort of snorty chuckle burst from her nose, and then she was stone-faced again. He turned so that the left arm was fully facing her so she couldn't miss it. "I got the treatment, too." She went on hopping. For 3 days I could not only move my arm up to here. She didn't even look. "Want to see my bruise?" Her eyes were never left the beanbag. He stood. He smiled. "Want to touch it?" It was as if he wasn't even there. So he ran off, found the others, to marvel at his bruise. He played with the guys, and when they came to taunt Dorothy, he did not feel as bad as he had before. They called her Fish Face and made fun of her name and kicked her beanbag off the hopscotch squares. Palmer stood there and back and gave a sly grin. "That'll teach you, Dorothy Grusick." At the time, she befuddled him. Not once did she raise her eyes to her tormentors, or say anything back. She did not run into her house. She did not cry. What kind of girl is this? She just kept playing hopscotch, as if nobody else was there. After a while, Beans could not take it any more, so they ran off. In the third week after the treatment, Palmer came to an end of his imaginary parade. His bruise had faded to a dim yellow blot, and the crowds had gone home. But something still was there. Palmer knew it was. It had been there all along, silent, hardly seen among the cheering crowd, a flash of black feather, now and then, an orange eye waiting. As he kicked the checkered soccer ball along the streets, he could feel it lurking in shadowy doorways behind shaded windows. He would not look. He felt it come out of the shadows and the sunlight and on back to neck to the frost. It was behind him. He picked up the ball and ran, but he could not run from time. It was the first week of August. Family Fest had arrived. Family Fest. Such a nice name. And a nice time. It was a week of talent contests, softball games, races, tilt-a-whirl, bumper cars, and music and barbecue and cotton candy. And shooting pigeons. If only the Family Fest would stop on Friday, Palmer had often wished, but it did not. It began on Monday and ended on Saturday. That Saturday, the 1st of August, 1 month after his birthday, was the worst day of the year. During the night before, trucks would bring in. He heard rumbling through the streets carrying wooden crates and from the old railroad station to the soccer field, and the crates held pigeons, 5,000 of them. Except on that day, Palmer had never seen a pigeon in town. Some, he heard, were trapped in the railroad yards of the great city 100 miles to the east. The rest were bought and paid for. Why anyone would pay for a pigeon only to shoot it was just one of the many questions about Pigeon Day that bewildered Palmer. Palmer's first Pigeon Day had occurred when he was 4. Certain moments 5 years later were still with him. The birds in the sky, and suddenly, not in the sky, only feathers fluttering, red fingers and lips of a man cheering, spewing specks of barbecue chicken, a man wearing a bright pink baseball cap, the smell of gun smoke. Most of all, the pigeons. The one pigeon that hurried across the grass, lopsided, as Palmer would have said then, as if one of its legs had been kicked out from under it, hurrying, hobbling, wobbling at goofy loops, tilting like a sailboat blown over, a boy chasing after it, running after, reaching for it, a boy laughing, the people laughing, Palmer thinking, that boy wants it for a pet. And then the pigeon was coming his way, flopping, righting itself, bobbing straight for the people, head bobbing, lopsided, and curved, of course. And then the people were shrieking and calling it, Wringer, Wringer. And the boy was chasing it. Sure enough, the boy caught it. Caught the hobbly-wobbling pigeon right in front of Palmer. And the pigeon's eye looked at Palmer, and the pigeon's eye was orange, and everyone clapped. And Palmer clapped too. He laughed and called out, good. And the boy closed his hands over the pigeon's neck and twisted his hands real quick, just like that. And Palmer heard a tiny sound, like a twig being stepped on. And then when the boy took his hand away, the pigeon's head hung down. The green grass so sadly dangled down through the pigeon, though the pigeon's eye was still round and orange. Palmer had turned to look up at his mother and said, why did he do that? And his mother had said, to put the pigeon out of its misery. Was the pigeon in misery? Palmer asked his mother. Yes, she said. Why? Said Palmer. His mother did not answer. She was looking at the sky. Because he was lopsided? She smiled thinly and said, yes. The boy didn't want him for a pet, did he? His mother kept looking at the sky, kept not answering. Palmer began to notice a gray, sour smell in the air. Suddenly, his mother grabbed his hand and pulled him away. As they squeezed through the crowd, their happy faces of the people had cheers and laughter, and the fingers from barbecue sauce gave Palmer the feeling that he was leaving the party. The boy, Palmer learned later, was called a ringer. It was his job to put the wounded pigeons out of their misery. During the following year, Palmer thought about that quote often. If the wounded pigeons were in misery, he wondered, why put them there in the first place by shooting them? Why not just let them all fly away? Palmer's mother had no answer to these questions. Palmer thought about it some more and concluded that all the pigeons must be miserable, wounded or not. and that was why they must be shot. And perhaps the pigeons themselves knew this. Perhaps when then the boxes were open and they flew to the sky over the soccer field, they were not trying to fly away at all. They were simply giving the shooters a good target. They were saying, here we are, put us out of our misery. How sad to be a pigeon, and how nice of the people that they would stop at nothing to help. They would shoot, they would ring, and Palmer imagined punching a hand grenade and a bayonet if they had to, anything to end the poor bird's misery. And this, Palmer guessed, was why the people were so happy, because every dangling, orange-eyed head was one less miserable creature to weigh heavy on their hearts. Heaven, Palmer thought with a smile, must be teeming with pigeons. On the mantel of the fake fireplace in the den of Palmer's house stood a statue of a pigeon. It was golden. It was beautiful. Words were etched around the shiny panel below the statue. Palmer could not yet read, so he pretended the words said, "In honor of all pigeons, the house that loves you." But the question did not stop. Killing the pigeons and putting them out of their misery stubbornly refused to mean the same thing. Palmer thought about misery, and it seemed to him that a shotgun was the only way to end it. When Palmer was miserable, for example, his mother or father would hold him close and wipe his tears. When Palmer's mother or father put him out of misery, they did not shoot him. They offered him a cookie. Then why, on Pigeon Day, did all those people bring guns instead of cookies? It was confusing. "Was Daddy a ringer?" Palmer asked his mother one day. After a minute, she said, "Better ask your father." So he asked his daddy, "Daddy, were you a ringer?" His father looked at him and said, "Yep." "Will I be a ringer too?" His father gave a snappy nod and said, "Sure thing, big guy." Sure thing. Palmer pronounced the words over and over. That day followed. Sure thing. Boys became ringers, he heard, when they became 10 years old. Palmer had attended his second Pigeon Day with Dorothy Gruzik and her family and his mother. They had other things to do. It was Dorothy's first. She pointed to the mountain of boxes, the far end of the field. "What are those for?" she asked Palmer. "And what are the pigeons for? What? Bleh. That's where the pigeons are," he told her. "What are they doing there?" she said. "Well, they want to get out," Palmer told her. He felt like an old pro cueing in the new kid. "They go from the big boxes to those little white boxes there, and then every little white box has 5 pigeons. Somebody pulls the strings and the door opens when the pigeon flies out." Her father had told them these things. Guessing how many pigeons are there? Dorothy gave it some thought. 100? Palmer smiled smugly. 5,000. Dorothy Gruzik's mouth fell open and her eyes rolled upward. She was imagining a sky full of pigeons. "Wow," she said. "Then what?" "Then they shoot them." For a long time, Dorothy Gruzik didn't move. It looked as if she were waiting for the rain to fall into her mouth, and then she finally turned her black eyes to Palmer. He wished he wasn't there. "What?" she said. "They shoot them," he repeated, and the words were dusty and bitter on his tongue. Seemed only one way to get rid of that bad taste, and that was to flush out of the mouth more words. "They go bam, bam, bam." They open up the box and the pigeon flies out and the gun goes bam and the bird goes. Palmer raised his hand high above his head, dived down to the ground to show her. For sound effect, he tried a newly learned whistle. And then another one comes out and bam, and another one and bam. And after bam, then they dive and they whistle. And the ringers run out to the pigeons, and if the pigeon isn't dead, the ringer wrings its neck. He brought his curled fists together and snapping them. Like that! He made a sound with the twig breaking. She was already running, tunneling through the crowd, bouncing off grown-ups' legs. Her mother was after her. Excuse me. Palmer bored to the back side of the crowd. Dorothy was running past the picnic tables, her mother chasing. Palmer called, They put them out of their misery. That's all. That's all. He discovered that he was crying. By the following year, Palmer no longer cared to watch. He spent Pigeon Day at the playground with Dorothy Grusick. So through the day, the squeak of the seesaw and the creak of the swings joined the sound of the shotguns. At the distance, they sounded like balloons popping. While they were on their swings, a boy he knew as Arthur Dodds came by. Arthur had not yet begun calling himself Beans. He was dashing through the playground when he spotted Palmer and Dorothy and skidded to a halt. "What you doing?" he demanded of the two of them. "We're swinging," said Dorothy. "What's it look like?" Even if she wasn't afraid. "They're shooting the pigeons," he said. His feet were still pointed towards the soccer field. His whole body was twitching. "Come on!" "We're staying here," said Dorothy. Palmer was glad that Dorothy answered. But now Arthur Dodds was heading straight for him. "What's your name?" he growled. "Palmer." "Your first name?" "That is my first name." "What kind of name is that?" What could Palmer say? He shrugged. Arthur Dodds came closer, and at that time he still had his baby teeth, which were colorful, and his second teeth would come. "You coming?" he said. Palmer did not know what to say. He looked at Dorothy. She was staring at him. Somehow her face gave him the answer. He shook his head no. Arthur Dodds exclaimed, "Sissy Missy, girly baby." He gave the swing chain a yank that Palmer was thrown like a bronco rider onto the ground. Arthur Dodds shook off, braying, I'm a ringer, I'm gonna get me a pigeon to ring in." And he did. And Palmer later heard the story. Arthur Dodds made a real nuisance of himself that day. He kept darting into the field to chase wounded pigeons, only to be chased away himself at the real ringers. Arthur Dodds, like Palmer, was only 6 years old at the time. Finally, he got out what he wanted, a shot bird. Instead of falling onto the soccer field, it made it to the picnic area before it came down. Arthur saw and lit out after it. He heard the women screaming. The bird had fallen right into the pink fringed stroller where her baby was sleeping. By the time Arthur got there, the pigeon was on the ground and being chased around picnic tables by half a dozen squealing toddlers. Arthur joined the chase, the birds flapping up onto the table. People screamed. Hot dogs flew. Arthur lunged across the table, knocking drinks, smashing pickled eggs, and snatched the pigeon by its legs on the bowl of chicken salad, according to the story. Arthur threw his arms in the air like a boxing champion in the crowd. "I got me one!" Then, right before the gaping eyes of the picnickers, he wrung its neck. Arthur Dodds wasn't finished. So proud was he of that dead pigeon that he took it home, wrapped it in newspaper, and hid it under his bed. For almost a week, he charged kids a quarter apiece to look. Then his mother started to smell something that was pretty soon. That was that. Palmer smelled something too. Something about his father that he would return from pigeon days. As often it happened, Palmer would wind up on his father's lap. It was his favorite place in the whole world, for he was safe from everything. But on those days he could smell the gray and sour odor of gun smoke, and the closer he snuggled into his father's shirt, the more he could smell it. Then he began smelling the gray, sour odor even when his father wasn't there, even when Pigeon Day was over. It might have happened in the morning as he sat at school, or at night as he lay in bed. It could have happened when his father's lap in the middle of the winter, when his shotgun had been locked away for months. The smell was sure to come on his birthday. It did not spoil his birthday as it did not spoil his father's lap, but it changed those things, so they did not quite feel as good as before. Other things changed. Arthur Dodds became Beans. Beans was joined by Billy Nartola, who became Muddo, and a new, very tall boy in town, only known as Henry. Palmer wanted to join them, but they said he was too small, too young, and that he had a funny first name, and they played with the girls. He played with little girls. little ones at that. Which wasn't true. The older he got, the less he had to do with Dorothy Gruzik. When he went off to first grade, he left her behind on the front steps clutching a doll. Second grade, he said to the guy, "She's my neighbor, that's all. I can't help it, can I? And anyway, what do you want to do with a first grader?" But they weren't listening. Palmer invited them to his 8th birthday party. No one came. So his mother stormed across the street, dragged Dorothy to the dining room table, and his mother and father and Dorothy sang happy birthday to him, and his mother had a big smile, but her eyes were red. That was the summer that Palmer's family went on a vacation trip. They stopped in the big city for a day. From the Tourist Information Center, they got a map and found themselves a walking tour of historic places. Pigeons were everywhere. Sidewalk, ledges, steps. Palmer saw one crossing the street with a crowd of people on greenlit and just another pedestrian. They strutted boldly, those pigeons, going about their business, pecking here, pecking there. They did not seem the least bit afraid or apologetic. They acted as if they belonged, as if this was their city, as well as the people's. And the people did not even seem to notice the pigeons. Palmer kept tugging at his parents. "Look, there's one. Look at that one." But the city people ignored him. No one had a shotgun, except for the wounded pigeon that was rung in front of him when he was 4. This was Palmer's first close look at the birds. He had heard that pigeons were dirty, filthy, nothing more than rats with wings. He looked and looked, but all he saw were plump, pretty birds in shiny coats. He was especially fascinated at how they moved. They did not hop like sparrows or robins, but they walked, the one pink foot in front of another, just like people. With each step, their head gave a little nod as just to say, "Yes, I will. I agree. You're right." As Palmer saw it, the pigeon was the most agreeable bird. They were passing through the park with many trees and benches. Palmer saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A man sitting on the bench was smothered in pigeons. They were on his shoulder, they were on his head, his lap, snapping up seeds that the man appeared to have poured over himself. And the pigeons were cooing, and the man was giggling. Or was the man cooing and the pigeons giggling? It was hard to tell. Back home, it occurred to Palmer that since now he could read quite well, he should have another look at that inscription. And the golden pigeon statue in the den said, "Sharpshooter Award Pigeon Day, 1989. There, standing before the gold pigeon, the odor of gun smoke came to him, and he understood that his father was a shooter. It was about then that Palmer began to feel a certain tilt to his life, time becoming a sliding board, at the bottom of which awaited his 10th birthday. Dean keeps asking, "Are you going to be a ringer?" Every time, Palmer would look straight into the crayon box of teeth and say, "Sure thing." And every time he said, he could feel his heart thump. For among all the changes in his life, one thing stayed the same. It was something that he had known since the second pigeon day, when he was with Dorothy Gruzik on the swings. He did not want to be a ringer.